Under the guise of caring for me, my own daughter tricked me into signing away my entire life savings, thinking I was just a confused old woman. She held me prisoner in my own home, cutting me off from the world and treating me like I was senile, all to rush a secret deadline she was desperate to meet. But she forgot one tiny detail. I spent 40 years as a bank manager, and the legal trap I set for her didn't just expose her crimes, it delivered a public humiliation so devastating her perfect reputation was shattered forever. The Sunday brunch was as always perfect. My daughter Clara made sure of it. The scent of fresh brewed coffee mingled with the lemon polish on the mahogany table, and the sunlight streaming through the bay window caught the edges of the sterling silver. Everything in my Westchester home was just so a testament to a life of careful planning and quiet success. But lately, a discordant note had crept into the harmony. Clara and her husband Mark were a picture of filial devotion. They filled my plate with lox and bagels, refilled my coffee before I could ask, and peppered their conversation with praise for my beautiful home, my garden, my resilience. It was all very lovely and all very false. I saw it in the way Mark's smile was a little too wide, a little too fixed. I saw it in the way Clara, despite her effusive compliments, held a tension in her shoulders that even her expensive cashmere sweater couldn't hide. And then there was the phone. She kept it face down on the table just beside her plate, a sleek, black rectangle of anxiety. Every few minutes, it would give a silent, almost imperceptible vibration, and her eyes would dart towards it, a flicker of panic, before she'd compose herself and ask me about the garden club. I've spent 40 years as a bank manager. I know how to read people who are trying to hide something. You don't watch a stock ticker with the same desperate hope that Clara watched that phone. Something was deeply wrong. This performance was part of a larger production that had started a few months ago. It began with concern, or what was packaged as concern. She told me she was worried about me being alone, worried about telemarketers and scammers. So she started screening my calls, letting the landline go to voicemail, and calling people back herself if she deemed them important enough. Then she started picking up my mail from the post office box, a kind gesture she'd said to save me the trouble. My world, once managed by me with quiet efficiency, was slowly being shrink-wrapped in her care, isolating me from the outside world, one helpful act at a time. After brunch, as Mark cleared the plates with a show of dutiful effort, Clara brought out a handsome leather portfolio. She told me her new estate planner was a miracle worker, a real shark, and that he'd drawn up some routine papers to better protect my assets. She spread them across the polished table, a daunting stack of legalese and signature lines. She talked a lot, her voice smooth and confident, using words like optimizing and streamlining. She pointed where I needed to sign her manicured finger, tapping the paper. I tried to read a paragraph about a land transfer mentioning the old meadow property my late husband and I had bought decades ago. When I paused, she just smiled reassuringly and explained it was a simple formality, just moving an asset into a new trust for better tax liability. Her explanation was a cloud of jargon designed to obscure, not clarify. I felt a pressure, a gentle but insistent rushing, as she guided my hand from one page to the next. My own pen felt foreign in my hand as I signed away pieces of my life, trusting the daughter I had raised. They were about to leave, the air filled with kisses on the cheek and promises to call tomorrow. Clara had forgotten her scarf in the guest room, and as she went to retrieve it, Mark was already starting the car outside. I stood in the quiet of my hallway, the silence of the house pressing in on me. And then I heard it. Her voice no longer smooth and reassuring, but a raw, panicked whisper from down the hall. It was a fragment of a conversation, sharp and ugly. I heard her say, "Not enough time. The deadline is Friday. Just get it done. I don't care how." There was a sharp click as the call ended. A moment later, she emerged from the guest room, the silk scarf elegantly draped around her neck. She smiled at me, her face a perfect, placid mask of daughterly love. But I had heard the truth behind it. The deadline wasn't for an estate planner, it was for something else entirely. And as I watched her walk out my front door, I knew with the cold certainty of a final ledger entry that I had just been expertly and ruthlessly robbed. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I didn't sleep that night. The image of Clara's serene smile after that monstrous phone call was burned into my mind. The shock had worn off by dawn, replaced by something colder and harder. Fear was there, yes, a knot in the pit of my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a lifetime of managing crises. You don't run a bank branch for 40 years without learning how to handle fraud. You just never expect the fraud to be sitting at your own brunch table. My daughter had a Friday deadline. That meant I had a timeline. My first move had to be precise. A direct confrontation was pointless. They would just lie. I needed to probe the weakest point in their little conspiracy, and that was undoubtedly Mark. Clara was driven by a desperation so deep it had become a kind of armor. Mark, on the other hand, was just along for the ride, and he was a terrible passenger. He lacked the conviction for this kind of betrayal. I waited until 10 in the morning, a respectable hour, and made the call. When he answered, I put on my most pleasant, slightly dotty, old lady voice. I told him I'd had a lovely chat with my old friend Carol, the realtor, and that she was just asking me about the tax assessment on the old Meadow property. It was all nonsense, of course, but it sounded plausible. Then I delivered the question I had spent the morning crafting. I asked him which title company he and Clara had used for the new trust documents, as Carol was unfamiliar with the one Clara had mentioned. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then came the stammering. He sputtered something about an online firm, a new tech-based group that handled everything digitally. His answer was a mess of buzzwords that directly contradicted the name of the very traditional old-world firm Clara had fed me yesterday. He knew he'd made a mistake the second he said it. He mumbled a pathetic excuse about another call coming in and hung up so abruptly I was left holding a dial tone. I set the receiver down, and then from the kitchen counter came a sound, a persistent, angry buzzing. It was the simplified phone Clara had given me, the one just for family. I walked over and watched it vibrate against the granite, the screen dark. A text message, then another and another. A frantic, silent storm of communication between a panicked husband and his furious wife, trying to patch the hole he had just blown in their story. Their guilt was vibrating on my countertop. That was the opening I needed. Their chaos was my cover. I went to the back of my husband's old closet to a dusty box of his service medals and keepsakes. Tucked underneath a folded flag was his old retired cell phone. It was a relic, a flip phone, but it was charged, and more importantly, it was untraceable to Clara. I took it to the basement, where the signal was weak but present, and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice. A gruff voice answered. I kept my own voice low and steady. I told him, "Frank, it's Eleanor Vance." Then I said the words my husband and I had arranged with him decades ago, a code for the unthinkable. I said code 1876. I need you. There was a pause, and then Frank's voice came back all business. He told me to stay put and say nothing to anyone. He was on his way. I felt a surge of hope, the first I'd felt in months. But it was short-lived. A few hours later, Clara's car pulled into the driveway. When she walked in, the mask was gone. Her face was cold, her eyes hard. There were no pleasantries. She walked straight to the landline on the hall table and unplugged it from the wall. She told me it was for my own good to prevent telemarketers from upsetting me. Then she looked at me, her expression devoid of any warmth, and informed me that she'd be staying for a few days to help me get my affairs in order. It wasn't a request. It was an announcement. The house, my sanctuary for 50 years, had just become my prison. I wasn't just fighting for a piece of land anymore. I was fighting for my freedom. To survive in a cage, you don't rattle the bars. You study the keeper. My daughter was now my keeper, and her cage was my own home. So I did the only thing I could. I retreated. The next morning, I put on my best performance of a confused, frail old woman. I found Clara in the kitchen, her back to me as she made coffee, and I began my apology. I told her I was so sorry for my behavior, that I'd been feeling muddled lately, and that my call to Mark was just a moment of old age paranoia. I could see the tension release from her shoulders. She turned her face, softening from a hard mask into the familiar, condescending sympathy I'd grown to loathe. She patted my arm and told me not to worry my pretty little head about it, that she would handle everything from now on. The danger in her mind had passed. She had won. With her guard down, her arrogance began to show. She treated my home like a hotel, taking long, important calls in the garden and leaving trails of paperwork in her wake. And as she relaxed, the source of her desperation became clearer. One afternoon, while I was supposedly taking a nap, I watched her from my bedroom window. She was pacing the stone patio like a trapped animal, phone pressed to her ear, her expression one of pure terror. I saw her phone light up with a message, and she physically flinched, a jolt of such primal fear that it told me everything. This wasn't just about money. This was about a threat. My mind, trained to see patterns in financial histories, started connecting the dots. Her vague talk last year of an exclusive tech fund, the new car that was quietly replaced with an older model, the way she flinched when the mail arrived. It was the classic tragic story of someone in over their head, a Ponzi scheme, I guessed, followed by private, high-interest loans to cover the losses. The piranhas were circling, and my daughter was the bait. And that photo she just saw on her phone, I had a sickening feeling it was of my grandchildren. While she saw a defeated old woman napping, I was at my writing desk meticulously preparing for war. In a small journal my husband had given me years ago, I documented everything. Every lie, every contradiction, every veiled threat. I noted the date and time of the fraudulent signing. I detailed Mark's panicked, contradictory phone call. I used my decades of banking experience to map out her likely strategy. She had the quitclaim deed, which gave her title. Now she needed to liquidate the asset, the Meadow property, before her Friday deadline. She'd need a forged bill of sale for a quick private transaction, something that would bypass the usual legal channels. Her arrogance, as I had counted on, made her careless. On Thursday afternoon, the day before her deadline, she got a heated call that required her full attention. She grabbed her briefcase and went out to the patio, slamming the glass door behind her, to yell at whoever was on the other end. She had left the briefcase unlatched on the floor of the study. My heart pounded, but my hands were steady. This was the moment. I moved to the study, my movements silent. I didn't have much time. I knelt down, opened the case, and saw a manila folder right on top. Inside were several threatening letters from what looked like a predatory lender. And underneath them, just as I'd predicted, was a freshly printed bill of sale for the Meadow property, with a forged signature at the bottom that was a crude imitation of my own. I pulled the old flip phone from my robe pocket. With a quiet click, I took a perfectly clear, damning photograph of the document. I had the proof. Now all I had to do was wait for Frank. Friday morning arrived with a suffocating stillness. It was the deadline day, and the air in the house was thin and electric. Clara was a ghost, flitting from room to room, her face pale, her phone clutched in her hand like a talisman. I, on the other hand, sat in my favorite armchair with a book, projecting an aura of serene obliviousness. I was a spider in the center of a web, and all I had to do was wait for the fly to make its final move. The doorbell rang at precisely 11 o'clock. The sound shattered the silence. Clara froze her eyes wide with a new kind of panic. She was expecting a courier, perhaps, or a desperate call, but not a visitor. She peered through the sidelight, and I saw her whole body stiffen. She opened the door just a crack, trying to block the entrance. But it was no use. Frank is a big man, not just in size, but in presence. He's carried the quiet, unshakable authority of a New York City detective for 40 years, and it doesn't just vanish with retirement. He held up a manila envelope and informed her in a calm, non-negotiable tone that he was here to discuss some irregularities in the Vance estate, as per my request. Clara's face, already pale, turned the color of ash. She tried to tell him it was a bad time that I was unwell, but he simply looked past her, his eyes meeting mine across the foyer. He gave a slight nod and walked right past her into the house. The keeper had just lost control of the cage door. Clara, realizing she was out of her depth, scrambled for her phone and made a frantic whispered call to Mark, telling him to get here immediately, that there was a huge problem. 20 minutes later, we were all assembled in the living room. It felt less like a family gathering and more like a hostile deposition. Frank sat opposite Clara and the now trembling Mark, the manila envelope resting on the coffee table between them. He began calmly laying out the facts. He explained that his inquiries into the new trust documents had led him to a dead end for a simple reason. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table, a printout from the state business registry. The title company Clara had named, he informed them, had never existed. Mark looked like he was going to be physically ill. Clara began to bluster, talking about shell corporations and complex holding firms, but her voice was thin and reedy. The first crack in the dam had appeared. Then it was my turn. I leaned forward and placed my little leather-bound journal on the table next to Frank's report. I told them it was a log I'd been keeping of recent events. Before they could process that, I pulled the old flip phone from my pocket. I opened the photo I had taken and held it up for them to see. The image was perfectly clear, the forged bill of sale, my signature crudely imitated at the bottom. That was the moment the dam broke. Mark made a choking sound, staring at his wife with pure horror. He was in on the deception, but he clearly had no idea she had escalated to felony forgery. He looked at her as if she were a stranger. Cornered, exposed, with no lies left to tell, Clara completely shattered. It wasn't a quiet breakdown. It was a volcanic eruption of shame, terror, and rage that had been festering for months. She began to sob, then scream. She confessed everything in a torrent of broken sentences. She told us about the slick investment manager who promised impossible returns, the Ponzi scheme that collapsed and wiped them out, the secret high-interest loans she took out to maintain their perfect Westchester lifestyle. Her voice cracked as she described the threats from the lenders, the pictures of her children, the crushing weight of knowing that the social ruin she feared more than anything was just one phone call away. She screamed that she had to do it, that my land was the only thing that could save the family's name, that I couldn't possibly understand the pressure she was under. The storm passed, leaving a hollow, ringing silence in its wake. My daughter was a weeping heap on the sofa, and my son-in-law was staring into space, his world completely dismantled. In that silence, I stood up. The frail, confused old woman was gone forever. I looked down at my daughter, not with rage, but with a cold, clear finality. My voice was steady, and it carried the weight of a judge's sentence. I told her the lies were over. I gave her one choice: She could pick up the phone, call the police, and confess to everything herself. Or, I said, turning my gaze to the retired detective sitting calmly in my living room, Frank would do it for her. They were powerless now. Their fate, which they had tried so desperately to control, was entirely in my hands. Here's the summary of my story so far. Please write Chapter 5, continuing from where we left off, maintaining consistency with the established plot characters and tone, of course. Here is a continuity summary for Chapter 1. Chapter 1, Core Plot Summary. Eleanor hosts her daughter Clara and son-in-law Mark for a Sunday brunch, noticing their forced cheerfulness and Clara's underlying anxiety. Under the guise of protecting her from scams, Clara has been systematically isolating Eleanor by screening her calls and managing her mail. Clara pressures Eleanor into signing a stack of routine estate documents, rushing her past a clause that transfers ownership of a valuable family property. As Clara is leaving, Eleanor overhears a panicked, whispered phone call about a deadline this Friday, confirming her suspicions of a deep deception. The main conflict was the tension between Clara's manipulative control disguised as care and Eleanor's internal growing suspicion. The outcome confirmed Eleanor's worst fears, transforming her from a passive family matriarch into an aware and threatened individual. Chapter 2. Character Development and Status. Eleanor Vance. Emotional state. Moved from quiet unease to a state of cold, certain alarm. Status. Is now fully aware she has been betrayed and is in danger. Motivation. Her primary motivation has shifted to understanding the scope of the threat and figuring out how to respond. Clara daughter. Emotional state. Revealed to be operating under extreme hidden desperation. Actions. Successfully committed fraud by tricking her mother into signing over property. Status. Believes her plan is working, but is clearly running out of time on an unknown deadline. Mark's son-in-law. Role. A nervous and less convincing accomplice to his wife's deception. New characters introduced? None. At the end of the chapter, Eleanor is alone in her Westchester home, physically isolated, but mentally sharp and aware of the immediate threat. Clara and Mark have left the house believing their deception was successful. Betrayal. Show 3. World building and setting. Location. Eleanor's well-maintained, high-status home in Westchester County, New York. Cultural element. The immense social pressure within their community to maintain a facade of wealth and success. Important item. The leather portfolio containing the fraudulent legal documents, specifically the quitclaim deed. Key asset. The Bay Meadow property. A valuable piece of family land that is now the central object of the conflict. Bosquare. Continuity hooks for next chapter. What is the urgent deadline? Clara must meet by Friday. Who was Clara speaking to on the phone, and what exactly must be done? Now that Eleanor is aware of the betrayal, what will her first move be, especially given her isolation? The desperation in Clara's voice foreshadows that she is capable of escalating her actions if her plan is threatened. The chapter ends on a cliffhanger, as Eleanor watches her smiling daughter leave, fully realizing the placid mask of family love hides a dangerous threat. Of course. Here is the continuity summary for Chapter 2. Chapter 1. Core Plot Summary. Eleanor strategically probes the conspiracy by calling Mark with an innocent-sounding but specific question about the fraudulent documents. Mark panics and gives a contradictory answer, confirming his and Clara's guilt and causing them to scramble to align their story. Using the distraction, Eleanor finds a hidden cell phone and calls a trusted family friend, a retired detective named Frank, using a secret code for help. Clara arrives, drops her caring facade, and establishes direct control by unplugging the landline and declaring she's staying, making Eleanor a prisoner. The chapter's main conflict was Eleanor's first countermove to test the conspiracy and secure help. The outcome was a tactical victory as she confirmed their guilt and called in an ally, but it resulted in a strategic loss of freedom as Clara escalated the situation. Chapter 2: Character Development and Status. Eleanor Vance. Decisions. Shifted from a passive victim to an active strategist initiating a plan. Status. Has successfully contacted an external ally for help. Emotional state. A brief moment of hope has been replaced by the immediate fear of being imprisoned. Clara daughter. Actions. Escalated from covert manipulation to overt oppressive control. Emotional state. Her demeanor has shifted from feigned warmth to cold, undisguised anger. Mark, son-in-law. Role. Proven to be the conspiracy's weak link, unable to handle unexpected pressure. New characters introduced. Frank. A retired NYPD detective and trusted friend of Eleanor and her late husband. At the end of the chapter, Eleanor is a prisoner in her own Westchester home under the direct supervision of her daughter. Clara is in the house with Eleanor acting as her warden. Mark is not present, but is aware his lies have been exposed. Chapter 3: World Building and Setting. Important item. Eleanor's old, untraceable flip phone, which serves as her secret lifeline. Lore. Code 1976. A prearranged distress signal between Eleanor and Frank, indicating financial foul play. Setting shift. Eleanor's home has officially transitioned from a place of subtle isolation to an explicit prison. Chapter 4. Continuity hooks for next chapter. When and how will Frank respond to Eleanor's cryptic message? How will Eleanor navigate being under Clara's constant watch? Will Clara discover the hidden cell phone? What is Clara's next move now that she has her mother physically contained ahead of the Friday deadline? Clara's willingness to imprison her mother foreshadows she may be capable of more dangerous actions. The chapter ends on a cliffhanger as Eleanor understands she is no longer just fighting for her assets, but for her physical freedom against her own daughter. Of course. Here is the continuity summary for Chapter 3. Chapter 1. Core Plot Summary. Eleanor executes a strategic retreat by feigning confusion and frailty, causing a relieved Clara to lower her guard. By observing Clara's panicked phone calls, Eleanor correctly deduces her daughter is a victim of a Ponzi scheme and is being threatened by predatory lenders. While pretending to rest, Eleanor secretly documents the entire conspiracy in a journal and anticipates Clara's next moves. Clara's resulting arrogance leads to a critical mistake. She leaves her briefcase unattended, allowing Eleanor to find and photograph a forged bill of sale for the family property. The chapter's main conflict was Eleanor's psychological battle against Clara while under house arrest. The outcome was a decisive victory for Eleanor, who not only manipulated her captor into a state of false security, but also acquired the hard evidence needed to destroy the conspiracy. Chama. M2. Character development and status. Eleanor Vance. Decisions. Chose to feign weakness as a strategic tool to gain an advantage. Skills. Demonstrated expertise in psychological assessment and covert evidence gathering. Status. Is now secretly armed with incontrovertible proof of her daughter's fraud. Clara daughter. Emotional state. Shifted from cold control to arrogant carelessness, underestimating her mother completely. Backstory. Her desperate motivation being a financially ruined victim of a Ponzi scheme and facing threats from loan sharks was revealed. Status. Remains oblivious that her crucial mistake has been discovered. New characters introduced? None. At the end of the chapter, Eleanor is still physically a prisoner in her home, but is now mentally in a position of power holding the key evidence. Clara is also in the home completely unaware that her plan is about to be exposed. Yeah. Chapter 3. World building and setting. Important item. A small secret journal where Eleanor is logging all evidence of the conspiracy. Key evidence. The forged bill of sale for the Meadow property, which proves Clara's intent to liquidate the asset. Key evidence. The digital photograph of the forged document, which now exists as proof outside of Clara's control. Chess. At 4. Continuity hooks for next chapter. Eleanor is now armed with proof. How will she deploy this evidence? Frank, the retired detective, has been called but has not yet appeared. When and how will he make his entrance? The Friday deadline is less than 20 hours away, meaning the final confrontation is imminent. The stage is set for a major power shift, with Eleanor holding a secret advantage. Clara's carelessness foreshadows that her desperate, poorly planned conspiracy is about to completely unravel. The chapter ends on a cliffhanger as Eleanor successfully captures the photographic proof that will serve as the primary weapon in her coming counterattack. Of course, here is the continuity summary for Chapter 4. Our 1. Core plot summary. Frank, a retired detective, arrives at Eleanor's request and authoritatively enters the house despite Clara's attempts to stop him. In the living room, Frank presents evidence disproving Clara's lies, after which Eleanor reveals her own proof, her journal, and a photo of a forged document. The revelation of the forgery causes Mark's alliance with Clara to fracture, leaving her completely exposed. Cornered and broken. Clara confesses the entire story of being scammed by a Ponzi scheme and threatened by loan sharks. Eleanor seizes total control of the situation and delivers an ultimatum: Clara must confess to the police or Frank will do it for her. The chapter's main conflict was a direct, orchestrated confrontation designed to expose the truth and break the conspiracy. The outcome was a complete power reversal, with Eleanor dismantling Clara's lies, forcing a full confession, and ending the chapter in absolute command. Bachka Shai. M2. Character development and status. Eleanor Vance. Status. Fully transformed from a strategic victim into the story's primary power holder. Emotional state. Calm, resolute, and authoritative. Actions. Successfully executed her counteroffensive and dictated the terms of surrender. Clara daughter. Emotional state. Experienced a complete emotional collapse leading to a desperate rage-fueled confession. Status. Is now exposed powerless and facing an ultimatum with life-altering consequences. Mark's son-in-law. Decisions. His loyalty to Clara shattered upon learning the full extent of her crimes. Status. Has become a shocked and disillusioned bystander rather than a co-conspirator. Frank Alley. Yale served as the calm official presence necessary to validate Eleanor's claims and enforce the consequences. New characters introduced? None. At the end of the chapter, Eleanor, Clara, Mark, and Frank are all in the living room. Eleanor is in command. Clara is emotionally devastated. Mark is in shock, and Frank is a calm, enforcing presence. Power 3. World building and setting. Key evidence. Frank's official report proving the title company Clara used was fictitious. Setting shift. The living room was transformed into a quasi-courtroom where the family's conspiracy was systematically dismantled. No 4. Continuity hooks for next chapter. Will Clara choose to call the police herself, or will she force Frank to do it? What will be the immediate legal and personal fallout from the confession? How will Mark react now that his wife's entire fraudulent enterprise has been laid bare? Eleanor's ultimatum has set the stage for a public reckoning which must now be delivered. The emotional climax has passed, but the promise of legal and social consequences, the mega climax, is yet to come. The chapter ends on a cliffhanger with Eleanor holding all the power, having forced her daughter into an impossible choice that will lead to certain ruin. Mission. Write the detailed script for Chapter 5. Instructions. Use first person. No dialogue formatting replace with narrative reflection. Write in a natural storytelling style. Write as if you were telling a story to a friend. Maintain emotional consistency. Chapter 5. Outline unlatched. Write Chapter 5 for the Westchester Deception. Mega Climax Chapter. Ultimate Climax Goals. Deliver the final public reckoning in a culturally authentic setting. Systematically dismantle the antagonist's remaining lies with undeniable proof. Ensure the judgment and consequences come from the system the antagonist respects legal and financial authority. Provide a satisfying resolution where justice is served, but in a manner that reflects the protagonist's integrity. Target 1. 650 tokens. Ultimate Peak Chapter. Required Mega Climax Elements. The setting. The scene is a lawyer's office. Present are Eleanor, her lawyer, Frank, Clara, and Mark. The meeting was arranged by Eleanor under the pretense of negotiating a family settlement to avoid public scandal. Systematic case presentation. Eleanor's lawyer calmly and methodically lays out the timeline of events, supported by a binder of evidence, Eleanor's journal, enlarged photos of the forged documents, and a sworn statement from Frank detailing his investigation. The true punishment. The lawyer then introduces a guest via video call, a senior fraud investigator from the Westchester County District Attorney's Office. The investigator informs Clara that her investors were part of a larger Ponzi scheme ring they are prosecuting, and the predatory lenders are also under investigation for extortion. The shame of being a foolish victim in the eyes of the law is a devastating blow to Clara's pride. The final consequences. Eleanor delivers the final terms. She will not press charges for the attempted fraud against her. However, the quitclaim deed is nullified. The meadow property will be placed in an irrevocable trust for her grandchildren's education, managed by a third party. Clara and Mark will have to face their financial ruin, the bankruptcy, the social fallout, the legal consequences from the DA on their own. Eleanor reclaims full legal and financial control, setting an unbreakable boundary. Cha. Carefully note the word count requirement and ensure a smooth transition from the previous part and maintains an engaging narrative tone suitable for a YouTube audio story. Output must is 100% English. Text only. Content of this chapter without title of chapter contains plain text only, no URL, no reference, no citation. No canvas mode when output. Walking out of that law office was like taking the first breath of clean air after being trapped in a smoke-filled room. The weight that had been pressing on me for months didn't just lift, it evaporated. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of that day unfolded not with a crash, but with the quiet, inevitable gravity of a collapsing building. I didn't have to do anything more. The world that Clara and Mark had built on a foundation of appearances and debt simply could not stand on its own. News in a place like Westchester travels in whispers. I heard it through friends in snippets of conversation at the grocery store. I saw the for sale sign go up on their sprawling lawn, a stark white flag of surrender. Soon after, their names vanished from the donor lists of the local charities and the guest lists for the galas they had once considered the center of their universe. The story of their spectacular bankruptcy tied to a larger, more embarrassing fraud investigation became the cautionary tale of the season. They weren't hated, they were pitied, which I knew for Clara was a fate far worse. They had become social ghosts haunting the edges of a world that had once been their kingdom. 6 months passed. The autumn leaves turned fell and were swept away. One crisp November afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from Mark. The envelope was plain, the address written in a hesitant hand. It was short, only a few paragraphs long. He wrote that he was working for a landscaping company now that the physical labor was hard, but honest. He didn't make excuses for his actions. He simply apologized for his weakness for standing by and allowing his fear to overpower his conscience. He said he hoped one day he could earn back a measure of my respect. There was a sincerity in his words that felt like the first green shoot after a long winter. From Clara, there was nothing, only silence. I heard through a cousin that she was bitter, blaming me for not liquidating my life to save her from the consequences of her own choices. He took the path of accountability. She remained trapped in the prison of her own denial. My life, in contrast, began to bloom again. The simple freedoms felt like luxuries. I reconnected with my old bridge club. I volunteered at the local library. Frank became a regular visitor, not as a detective, but as a friend coming by for coffee and conversation. The cloud of suspicion I had been living under was gone, and the sunlight felt wonderful. The biggest change, however, was the meadow property. It had been the object of so much greed and pain, and I couldn't bear the thought of it simply being sold to another developer. So I made a different choice. I contacted a local land trust and arranged to sell it to them for a nominal fee, with the sole condition that it be preserved as a public park, a place for families, for nature, for peace. It was my final act of turning something ugly into something beautiful, cementing a legacy of community, not of conflict. And so here I am. I'm sitting on a bench in that very park, a small plaque nearby, dedicating it as Vance Park. The air is cool and the sound of children laughing carries on the wind. It's been a year since that day in the lawyer's office. My phone buzzes with a text. It's a picture from my grandchildren showing off their report cards. I smile a genuine, uncomplicated smile. A moment later, the phone rings. The screen shows Mark's name. Our weekly check-in, a new tradition he started built, on a foundation of respect and firm boundaries. I look out at the open field at the families enjoying the afternoon sun, and I answer my voice calm and steady. The past is settled, the present is peaceful, and the future is finally my own. When all the accounts were settled and the dust finally cleared, a simple truth remained. The most profound justice isn't always a punishment delivered by an outside force, but the inescapable reality that people build for themselves brick by brick. One woman had spent a lifetime terrified of losing the perfect image she had built, only to discover her obsession with appearances had become a prison, far colder and more isolating than any court could decree. The other, by choosing to honor her own integrity, found a freedom she had forgotten was possible, proving that true strength is not the status you project, but the character you hold when no one else is watching.